Um, Thanks for recording, Annie. Welcome, everyone. People in Portland all the way to Chloe from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Welcome, and thank you for being here with us today. A few notes as we begin. Closed captioning is enabled, and so if you would like to view a live transcript throughout this presentation, you can click the button at the bottom of your screen that says CC. If you haven't already, we invite you to add your pronouns to your name. And we want to begin with a land acknowledgement. So the Portland metro area, which is where many of us are, rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and use the plentiful natural resources of the area. And this evening we'll be talking about housing and housing solidarity, and we wanted to start that conversation by recognizing whose land we are on. And for those of you who aren't in the Portland area, we hope that this map website was helpful in identifying, if you didn't already know, whose native land you are on. Thank you to those who continue introducing themselves in the chat. It's really great to have you all here. And I am going to pass to Coco to introduce what we're up to tonight.
Hi, everyone. My name is Coco, and I'm going to tell you who we are. So we are a collective of white Portland-based activists and organizers who came together around a shared experience of housing privilege and a desire to shift that power and privilege and interrupt the inequitable cycles of intergenerational wealth and ownership. So we work in partnership with and amplify the work of existing organizations, and we wanted to take a moment to share about some of our partner organizations. So first, Portland Neighbors Welcome is an all-volunteer housing advocacy organization that's dedicated to ensuring that every present and future Portlander can find and keep a safe, stable home that they can afford. Resource Generation is a multiracial membership community of young people ages 18 to 35 with wealth and or class privilege who are committed to the equitable distribution of wealth, land, and power. Taking Ownership PDX is a local organization that renovates and revives Black-owned homes that have requested help, with an emphasis on enabling Black homeowners to age in place, generate wealth, and simultaneously deter predatory investors and realtors to deflect the gentrification process. Lastly, Real Estate Professionals Against Institutional Racism, or REPAIR, is a group of realtors who have come together to learn intentional steps they can take to recognize and address racism in real estate. We also want to acknowledge our position and our positionality on this topic. Several of us who have organized this event have benefited from white wealth accumulation, and this training is oriented towards those who have benefited from white wealth accumulation. We also want to be clear that there's a difference between accumulated wealth and income. So income is the amount of money that someone makes today, but some people who don't make much money today might still have the privilege of accumulated wealth in their family. That might look like graduating from higher ed without debt, or owning a home, or having family members with wealth who can help them buy their first home. While parts of this training are oriented to people who have benefited from white wealth accumulation, the educational pieces in this presentation share a history that many of us weren't taught. The history is for everyone and explains one major source of white wealth accumulation: housing. So after the history overview, we'll present scalable action options that everyone can participate in. And then I want to go over the goals of this event. So the goals for this evening, we're going to review the history of racism in Portland's housing policies and city planning. You're going to hear personal stories about ways that we've tried to take action. And then you'll learn about ways that you can take action. And throughout the evening, feel free to ask questions in the chat during the event. We won't have time during the presentation to answer those questions, but we will have time after at the end. And I'm going to pass it back to Allison for a quick little tech note.
Yeah, thanks. I saw at least one comment in the chat of someone having technical issues seeing the screen. So if anyone is struggling with tech issues, one thing that you might try if you joined through Eventbrite is logging out, and rather than clicking like join through Eventbrite, you can click join through Zoom, and that might solve your problem. I hope it does. And I will now pass to Love.
Great, thank you everyone so much for being here. My name's Love and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm gonna take us through some history of the state and the city we now call Oregon and Portland, focusing on housing policy and city planning that has led to the disparities in housing that are deeply racialized today. And just up top, it's important to say that this history is not comprehensive or complete. It's not the history, it's a history told from my particular perspective as a white woman with a background in city planning and housing policy. So there's a lot of information that's not here, but I hope you come away having learned something new. And I give my deepest gratitude to the scholars and the historians who did this work and really just kind of here gathering it for you. And we'll link to some of those scholars at the end and share them out. In order to move forward differently, we have to understand our past, right? So while this history is important for all of us to know, I want to just encourage BIPOC listeners to take care because there's a lot here and it can be hard to hear. So please just take care of yourselves. All right, so to ground ourselves a little bit, what kind of racism are we talking about here? This chart shows sort of different levels of racism. First, individual racism is about the beliefs in your own head, like stereotypes you might hold about people consciously or unconsciously. Interpersonal racism is about how those beliefs play out into interactions you have with other people on an individual level. And then on the right side, institutional racism is about how racism plays out at the organizational level. So for example, in institutions like the city government or TriMet, or a department within the state or federal government. And then structural racism is about how interactions across institutions kind of compounds racism. And so today we'll be focusing on the systemic racism that happens both within and across institutions that have to do with housing, both in the public and private sector. So first, let's start with the founding of what we now call Oregon. For thousands of years, more than 60 indigenous tribes lived in Oregon and spoke at least 18 languages across hundreds of villages. And we know that white settlement of Oregon meant genocide, pandemics, displacement, and violence. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 put the practice of removing Native Americans from their ancestral lands into law, including in all of what's now Portland, in order to make way for white settlement. And so then in 1954, more laws abolished the tribal governments of 61 tribes in Oregon. The state and federal governments took their land, broke their treaties. The goal of this was to assimilate Native people and stop providing them services. And so as a result of this, a lot of tribal members moved to the city, into Portland. In the 70s and 80s, the federal government started to re-recognize tribal governments, but even so, this set a lot of tribes back 20 years in their advocacy because they'd spent all that time just fighting to be recognized by the government. And today, according to Metro, there's almost 60,000 urban Native people living in Portland, representing over 380 tribal affiliations. So Indigenous people are still here, and they face some of the biggest disparities in Portland and in Oregon. So in 1850, the Donation Land Claim Act really determined who got land in the Oregon Territory. White male settlers who came were each given 320 acres of stolen indigenous land, or 640 acres if they were married. And just for reference, one Portland city block is about 1 acre. So that's a lot of land. Other acts like the Homestead Act followed that and gave more free stolen land to white people. And this really formed the foundation of the state as we know it and the land ownership patterns that we still see today. And then in 1844, the government of the territory passed a law that banned slavery, but it also forbid Black people from being here and said that any Black person remaining would be lashed publicly every 6 months until they left. So slavery was outlawed, but not because Oregonians were abolitionists. They were not. Slavery was outlawed because people didn't want to face the economic competition from slaveholders and enslaved people. Then in 1857, Oregon finally became a state, and its constitution banned Black people from coming to the state, residing in the state, or holding property in the state. And in fact, Oregon had more KKK members per capita than any other state, with 30,000 at its peak. And in 1921, Oregonians elected a guy named Walter Pierce as governor, and he was a card-carrying Klan member. So scholars like Walida and Marisha and others have described this history as an attempt to make Oregon a white utopia. And today it is still the whitest, Portland is still the whitest big city in America. So now let's talk about sundown towns. These were places, cities and towns across the country where people of color, and most often Black people specifically, were told either implicitly through reputation or explicitly through things like signs that they'd better be out of town by the time it gets dark, or bad things will happen, up to and including death. There were at least 27 sundown towns in Oregon, and in the Portland metro area that included Lake Oswego, Oregon City, and Vancouver, Washington. Now we're going to talk about the history of zoning. So what is zoning? Zoning sounds boring, but it's actually really important because it's the laws that determine what you are allowed to build on any given piece of land in a city. So it covers things like what you're allowed to use the building for, whether it's housing or businesses, the size and the shape of the building, the number of homes you can build, and things like that. So this is the current zoning map of Portland today. And all the colors mean different things, but let's go back in time a little bit. So when cities across the country first got started with zoning in the early 1900s, they would literally write into the zoning code what races of people could live in what part of town. So eventually the Supreme Court struck this down, but we should remember that the origins of zoning were explicitly racist. And so in order to preserve the racist intent of zoning, white people had to find other ways to keep people of color out, and they did this through single-family zoning, which required enough money to buy a whole plot of land and a whole house, instead of just one unit in a building, for example. It also required minimum lot sizes for how big that piece of land had to be, and other things like that. And so we know that wealth and poverty are racialized in this country, so requiring people to have more money to live in a place is a way to keep people of color out, generally. And so this is Portland's first zoning map from 1924. The yellow is the single family zones, and you can see neighborhoods like Eastmoreland and Laurelhurst and Beaumont around the Alameda Ridge circled in red there. So then Robert Moses came to town. Robert Moses was a famous highway planner from New York who decimated neighborhoods and cities across the country for highway construction. Of course, these neighborhoods were mostly people of color and Black people specifically. In Portland, he proposed the freeways that we have today, as well as a lot more. And he also recommended vastly expanding the single family zoning. He said in a plan from 1943 that excessively large areas have been zoned for apartments. He said Portland is a city of single family homes, and that he was of the opinion that only a very small percentage of the area of the city should be set apart for multiple dwellings. So then in 1959, the city's next zoning code expanded single family zoning, and banned things like duplexes and triplexes like you see in Buckman and the sort of inner east side. And it also banned apartment buildings in most of the city. So that again means that to live in these neighborhoods, you have to be able to afford a whole house, which is much more expensive than an apartment unit or part of a triplex, for example. Another way people stuck to the intentions of racist zoning was through racial covenants. And these are lines in the deed you get when you buy a house that explicitly prohibited people of various races from buying or owning or living in a house unless they were servants. So often these deeds were on individual houses, but in some cases, like in Laurelhurst shown here, entire neighborhoods organize themselves to put racial covenants on the whole neighborhood. And you can see the language from Laurelhurst on the right. So this is zooming out of that map a little bit. This is a map of the whole city, and it shows some of the racial covenants that are on individual properties. It's a little bit small, but there's kind of a map of individual properties with covenants. And the map is actually really incomplete because most people don't even know that these deeds exist on their property still today. And it's also, so it's very hard to find them, and it's also really hard to remove them. So now we'll talk about redlining, which is probably the most well-known practice that has to do with housing and racism, but let's go over it. So in the 1930s and 40s, government agencies, the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, they would only offer loans or loan insurance in certain areas, and these areas corresponded heavily with race. So these redlining maps show what these agencies were thinking about these areas. And the place where all this hit hardest was Albina, which is the area that includes a lot of the historically Black neighborhoods in North and Northeast Portland. So just to give a quick history of the neighborhood, going back to World War II, there were a lot of jobs that were coming in into the shipyards, and the company Kaiser built temporary housing in Vanport on Portland's northern edge for all the new people coming to fill the jobs, which is what you can see here on the left. Many people came from the southern states, including thousands of Black workers, and the shipyards also attracted Indigenous people who had left reservations to work there. So there were about 40,000 people living in Vanport during World War II, and on Memorial Day in 1948, Vanport flooded, which you can see on the right. The Housing Authority and the Army Corps of Engineers hadn't prepared enough, and they told residents that the dikes would hold, but they did not. It's been said that the flood killed 15 people, but some people think it was a lot more than that. And over 6,000 Black people were displaced, as well as 10,000 other people. So after the flood, Albina was the only place that Black people were allowed to buy homes, because back in 1919, the Realty Board of Portland had put into their code of ethics that realtors and bankers couldn't sell houses or give loans to Black people or Asian people for homes in white neighborhoods. Realtors limited Black people to Albina through this form of racial steering, with 80% of Black families living around Williams Avenue in 1920. And also by 1957, 90% of realtors said they would not sell a home to a Black person in a white neighborhood. And this anti-Black housing discrimination really occurred regardless of class. So despite the fact that some of these racist policies were cloaked in concerns about income and declining property values, Black families who were able to buy into white neighborhoods actually increased the property values there. That's because the housing supply available to them was so constricted that they had to really bid up the prices when they were able to buy. And Black people tended to also be more educated than their white neighborhoods and than their white neighbors, and of higher social classes too. So these maps show homes in some parts of Southeast Portland owned by notable Black Portlanders. This is around Ladd's Addition on the left, and Brooklyn and Selwood neighborhoods on the right. And oftentimes, in order to buy homes in white neighborhoods, Black families would have to find a white seller willing to sell to them directly without a loan, or they'd have to find a white friend who would basically pretend to buy the home for them. So now let's look at the implications of redlining and the void of capital for Albina. You can see here how the federal government was describing Albina at the time. So people couldn't get loans for home repairs either. So homes deteriorated, and that happened even more quickly than usual because families were overcrowded into, the small number of homes they were allowed to live in the city. They were often doubled up. That also meant that absentee landlords couldn't sell the homes that they didn't want anymore. And so they stopped putting care into them. And at the same time, they charged high rent because their tenants had very few other options. So in the King and the Boise neighborhoods, those neighborhoods made up about 1% of the city's land, but about 26% of the abandoned housing units. So then in urban renewal was a practice that was happening all over the country in the 50s and the 60s, 70s, where the federal government gave cities money to designate certain neighborhoods as blighted or run down in order to justify tearing them down and building infrastructure projects. And of course, again, most of these neighborhoods were Black neighborhoods and other communities of color, and Portland was no different on that front. So city plans laid out the blight designations and really deemed entire neighborhoods expendable, and they pointed to the people living there as the cause. So you can see in 1967, the Portland Development Commission said that there's little doubt that the greatest concentration of Portland's urban blight can be found in Albina around the Emmanuel Hospital area. They said approximately 75 to 80% of Portland's Black population live there. And then in 1962, the city put out another plan that said urban renewal, largely clearance, appears to be the only solution to not just the blight that exists in central Albina, but also to avoid the spread of that blight to other areas. So you can see there's kind of this conflation between property conditions and the people living there, that they're talking about blight, which is really like the language of disease. And so they're trying to prevent the spread of conditions and people to other areas. In 1956, Portland voters approved construction of the Memorial Coliseum, which you may have been to, in the lower part of Albina. And so this destroyed 476 homes, half of which were owned by Black people. And lots of folks had to move to the upper part of Albina. But then also in 1956, the Federal Highway Act gave money to Portland to build I-5 through North Portland, which included Upper Albina, where a lot of people had been displaced to. So we should remember that there were other freeways proposed in white neighborhoods too, like the very famous Mount Hood Freeway that never happened. That was proposed around Division Street. So both white and Black neighborhoods had organized protests against the freeways, but I-5 got built through Albina and Southeast Portland was spared. And then in 1967, the city approved an expansion of the Emmanuel Hospital that took out 76 acres and 300 Black-owned homes and businesses, which Black people had built into a thriving business district despite all the racist policies we've been talking about. So now let's talk about city planning in the 70s and 80s and 90s, a little more recently. So the city put out the 1977 population strategy, which explicitly proclaimed that the city of Portland would choose to attract and retain the white middle-class homeowners that were fleeing to the suburbs across the country and what was known as white flight, instead of a social services strategy that would support low-income people and minorities and renters who are already living in Portland. And so, as you can see here, the city chose to focus major energy on keeping and attracting employed home-owning families with children, which we have seen are mostly white. And this guided the 1980 comprehensive plan. And the comprehensive plan is sort of the overall plan for zoning and housing policy for a city. And it's required by the state to plan for population growth. So the 1980 comprehensive plan and neighborhood plans for certain parts of town were happening around that same time, but different neighborhoods were treated very differently. These are zoning maps and there's kind of a lot going on, but you can see more blue and purple in Albina on the left here. That blue and purple is multifamily and commercial zoning, whereas in Southwest, you can see more yellow and green, which is single family and open space zoning. So whiter, wealthier Southwest Portland was able to close itself off to more housing, whereas East Portland and Albina were zoned for more multifamily housing after Albina was decimated by I-5 and the other urban renewal projects. So next we're going to talk about a more recent type of exploitation that was happening in the 80s and the 90s. This is risky lending in the Dominion Capital scam, which was basically a collusion among banks to disinvest from Albina, and they refused to provide traditional mortgages so that they could take advantage of people with other schemes. So the Oregonian did a series of investigative reporting in 1990 and found that in 1987, all the banks in Portland made just 10 mortgage loans to the entire 4 census tract area in Albina, and only 9 the next year. And so this is about 10% of the average number of loans for the city. And so after this, the predatory lenders sort of swooped in to take advantage of people who couldn't get conventional mortgage loans in Albina. And a lender called Dominion Capital became the subject of the investigation that found that that company and other companies had set up hundreds of buyers in risky loans, specifically because they had little competition from conventional lenders. So they kind of sold homes for more than they were worth, but they used a type of land sale contract that kept the actual ownership with the firm. And so they also lent homeowners money for home repairs. So people would fix up a home and then they would want to sell it, but they would find out that they didn't actually own the home at all. And the lenders would also put in balloon payment clauses into the mortgage, and they would evict people after they couldn't pay the balloon payment clause that came on after a couple of years. And so Dominion Capital did this with 350 homes in Albina, not to mention the other lenders. And the state was aware of all these practices and the violations that were breaking laws, but did nothing to stop them. So this is quite literally white collar crime. And as you can see here, many neighborhood activists felt that these people had done more to hasten the deterioration of Albina than the crack dealers and gangbangers, said Karen Gibson, who's the author of a really seminal research paper called Bleeding Albina, which we'll link to. So by the early 2000s, the city's relationship to Albina specifically, and other neighborhoods where Black people and other people of color are living kind of more generally, can be characterized as kind of swinging between neglect and active targeting, according to Karen Gibson. And so this occurred through both the destruction in the form of urban renewal that we talked about, and also through public investment that really intended to improve conditions, but actually destabilized and displaced people that live there because there weren't any housing controls in place to keep people in place as property values rose. So one example of this happened again in 2000 when the city created another urban renewal area around Interstate Avenue that, among other things, would be where the Max Yellow Line would go through. And so at the time, the city set out goals for anti-displacement and promised to build 3,000 units of housing in the area, including affordable housing. But the funding didn't come through and the city did not build the housing. So since that time, home prices have really skyrocketed, in part due to the attraction of the train and the other amenities that the city funded in North Portland, which has pushed people out. And so you can see in this chart the significant dip in the number of Black people living in Portland's historically Black area around Interstate. And there's still a lot of community activism trying to address all of these failures by the city and the state, and this is all still going on today. So we all know intuitively that housing is getting less and less affordable in Portland across the city. But I'm going to show you some maps from the Portland Housing Bureau's 2020 report. And these maps show Portland's neighborhoods and where different people can afford to rent or buy homes. These two maps are showing us where the average Native American household can afford to rent on the left and buy a home on the right. So you can see the average Native household can afford to rent in only 4 neighborhoods in East Portland near the border with Gresham, and they can't afford to buy a home anywhere in Portland. And so these maps are showing us that there are no neighborhoods where the average Black family can afford to rent on the left and own a home on the right. So this means that there's literally no neighborhood in Portland where the average Black family can afford to live at all. So I just want to let that sink in for a minute. And the outcomes for Latinx households, Asian households, and Pacific Islander households are all also worse than the outcomes for white households. And a lot of neighborhoods are not affordable to them. So meanwhile, the flip side of all these racist policies that have harmed Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color is that white people benefited and continue to benefit. So let's go back to redlining. The flip side of redlining was greenlining, right? You'll remember there were 4 colors: red, yellow, blue, and green. And so here's an example of greenlining in the Alameda Ridge neighborhood. You'll remember that these neighborhoods were also generally the ones that got that early single family zoning. And you can see that some of the justification for the greenlining was the absence of Black and foreign-born families. So neighborhoods like this are now concentrations of mostly white wealth. These areas can be called racially concentrated areas of affluence. And in this map from the city, you can see the overlap with the original single family zones and that Black outline there, which you'll remember were drawn based on racist desires to keep people of color out after racial zoning was struck down in 1917. And this map shows the value of mortgage interest deductions that each household got. So the darker the orange, the more the claimant got in tax breaks. And those of you who own homes are familiar with mortgage interest deductions, and it's a tax benefit that subsidizes home ownership, even for rich people, which we've seen as something that disproportionately white people are able to access. And it's also an indicator of home value, and there's significant overlap with the original single family zones that we saw on the previous slides, which again were created to preserve the intent of racial zoning. And then on the flip side, this map shows economic vulnerability, and it's basically the inverse of the previous maps. So the blue scale index includes people of color, renters, low-income households, and people without a college degree. And you can see the overlap with the single family zones here as well. It's the lighter areas which are less vulnerable. And then to close, I just want to give you a little sample of what kind of investment the state is making to close the racial gap in homeownership today. So last year, 65% of white people in Oregon own their homes compared to 32% of Black people. So that's almost double. And also last year, the state legislature invested $17 million to close this Black-white homeownership gap. In Portland, the median home price in August of 2021 was $535,000. So just doing some quick math, that means the investment by the state is basically equal to what it would take to buy 31.8 homes for Black families in Portland. And this is totally not a fair metric. The money is not like intended to directly purchase entire homes for people. So it's not like an apples to apples comparison at all. I just wanted to highlight, like, give you a sense of the level of investment that happens in a particular legislative session in a particular year and how much need there is that's still not being met. So it's important that we both, organize for collective action and policy change and investment at all levels of government. And it's important that those of us, particularly white people who have benefited from racialized wealth accumulation at any type of scale, it's important that we can think about our own financial privilege and take actions in support of our community. So with that, thank you very much. I'm going to now turn it over to my co-organizers to share some stories of things they've done.
Thank you, Love, for sharing that history. So I'm Sharona. I use they and them pronouns, and I just wanted to share a little bit of my story in one way that I took action that was actually inspired by Annie Moss, who you'll hear from after me. So my whole story is kind of laid out on the slide here. So basically, I was born and raised in an upper class white Jewish family in New York, and I graduated college with my graduate degree as well, debt-free. And then I moved out here to Portland. I actually initially moved to the West Side because I got a high-paying tech job working at Intel. My partner at the time also came out here with me a couple years later, and he was also raised in an upper-class family and had no school debt. So between the two of us, and with some help from his family, we were able to get help with a down payment and buy our first home in our mid-20s. And about 5 years later, that home that we had bought in Beaverton in 2016 had made a lot of money, and we were able to move into Southeast Portland. And in the process of the sale, as I had started getting more engaged in this work and my own anti-racist education, I was coming to terms with this privilege that I had. And so I started reaching out to folks in the community to see what I could do as part of this process to redistribute some of the money. So my husband and I decided to commit 10% of the profit that we were making off of that home to help a BIPOC family to purchase their first home. And through this group of us that's here, I was actually able to connect directly with a family, and we had a brief call over Zoom to share a little bit about our stories. I'm a member of Resource Generation, and in Resource Generation, we call them our money stories, where our money came from, what our family's history of money is. And then I was able to gift that person and their family $20,000 to directly enable them to purchase their first home. So that's my quick story, and a couple of other ideas I wanted to share around this, because I know not everyone is able to commit to that kind of gift, but there's a few other ideas that have come up as we've talked through this. I'm actually in the process now of selling a home again, and the realtor I'm working with and I had some conversation about this idea of when you sell a home, especially in this market, there are so many offers that come in, and there's a desire to pick someone who you feel like maybe is a lower offer because you think that they maybe deserve the home more. And I know that recently Oregon banned people being able to give you like letters with their offers. So one thing I talked about with my realtor is this idea of, rather than trying to choose the lowest offer, to look at the delta between that high offer that you might select and the lower offer, and commit to donating the delta between those offers to a cause that is actually helping some marginalized communities directly. And we'll share some of those places where you could donate that money. And another thing to consider for those of you who are not planning to sell a home anytime soon is that there is this thing called a HELOC, a home equity line of credit, that you can take out in your home in order, and people often do this in order to do renovations, but you could also take out a HELOC in order to distribute money to another family and then slowly pay that money back in the same way you would pay off any other loan. So I just wanted to share a couple of those ideas, and then I will pass it to my co-organizer, Annie Moss, to share her story.
Well, thank you, Sharona. It's great to see you all here. I'm really excited about how many people have shown interest in this topic. So I'm going to give you a little context for my story. Similar to Sharona, I grew up with a fair amount of privilege. I grew up in rural Oregon and kind of went through my life similarly, debt-free education. And by the time I was in my mid-20s, I was able to purchase my first home here in Portland in the Alameda neighborhood. And shortly after that, I started to get involved with resource generation. I was really, as a young person, was really trying to make sense of the disparity I saw between my own upbringing and a lot of the folks around me. Basically everywhere I went throughout my whole life, that disparity existed. And so really trying to grapple with how to convert the shame and guilt that was associated with that into something more productive. And resource generation was really, really helpful with that. And through resource generation, I started thinking about kind of how to tie my own action around racial justice and economic justice, two things that really mattered to me as a way to sort of bolster the like sustainability of taking action. And one thing I identified as being really key to this was homeownership. Housing has been a symbol of privilege and a source of so much joy and security and well-being for me and my family. My parents, when I was young, were able to build their dream home that I grew up in. It was a safe and wonderful place. And then being able, as you know, much younger than most of my friends, to purchase a home in Portland. And I saw that as being this, you know, sort of the tension in that symbol between being something that was both really a wonderful part of my life, but also really indicative of my privilege. So I decided that I wanted to sell my home in Albina, in the Albina neighborhood, and I wanted to get creative with it. So I started to try to do some research about ways to get creative with redistribution via housing, and it was quite a puzzle. I talked to realtors, I talked to lawyers, I tried to talk to people at PSU, like, you know, people like housing experts, and basically people were just like there just weren't a ton of models. I had seen things in other cities that had been done, but I was really struggling with how to make this work with my home and in Portland. And ultimately, I reached out to Randall Wyatt, who started taking ownership. We'll be hearing from him momentarily. And because I reached out to him and I was like, I don't know, maybe you know some like cool radical realtors or people who could help me navigate this process. And Randall's response was, maybe I want to buy your home. So we got on the phone and had a phone call, and basically the wheels at that point were in motion. And because of Randall's work in housing, and because I had purchased a home, we both had realtors who could represent us through the process. And what I decided to do was sell Randall my home for the remainder of what I had left on the mortgage and gift the equity. So basically, I sold the home for about a third of what I could have sold it for on the regular profit maximizing market. And it was a great process, and I learned some things that I want to share with you, because one of the reasons we have you all here in this room tonight is because we're really hoping that this will inspire action. You know, that all these stories and this history will inspire action for other folks who are particularly white homeowners in Portland to get creative with redistribution as well. So I had some really clear goals when I was thinking about how I wanted to go about this process. I wanted to minimize red tape. I didn't want an application process. I didn't want to be choosing the most deserving person. I really needed to just trust the process. And so when Randall and I first connected and crossed paths, it was just like, all right, this is what's happening. Like it just was, it just seemed like it was kind of meant to be. And the other thing I really wanted to do was decenter my own idea, or the ideas had been ingrained with around what financial responsibility looked like. I didn't want to emphasize how I could, get tax benefits from the process. And I really wanted to avoid any models that would limit homeowner agency. All of the people who care deeply about me and really wanted to make sure I was protecting myself had questions about like, well, do you want to make sure that it can't get resold? Or, how do you want to make sure that this really, protects your values? And to me, for Randall to own this home, and if at any moment he wants to sell it and make a profit and do whatever he wants with that money, that is protecting my values. It was less important to me that, this is his home forever and ever. It was more important to me that I just sort of hand that over to somebody else. And then I want to share, so I would just say that when you all are thinking about different ways to get creative with redistribution, being clear on your goals, but then being kind of flexible on the idea might be really key to the process, because there's so few roadmaps that for folks to follow. So knowing what you kind of, knowing the goals of what you want to accomplish, but then getting creative about how to accomplish that. And I think Sharona just gave some really great examples of that. And then two lessons that I want to share from my process. One is that supportive community is so key. As a white person who comes from a background of people who are very, financially literate, financially responsible, it's easy to feel like you're, doing something irresponsible or foolish. And in my deepest heart of hearts, I knew that wasn't true, but it was really helpful along the way to have my resource generation community to reach out to and to just be like, I'm doing this thing. It feels really big. It feels really scary. And to have them back me up and say like, yes, this is what our values are. What you're doing is great. And, you know, even if the financial system looks at you and thinks that you're a total weirdo, we look at you and think that, you know, you're acting in alignment with your values, which is what I really wanted to be doing. And the second lesson I learned is that security is about so much more than money. I say that with, you know, the big fat grain of salt, which is that we all need a certain amount of money to be secure and safe in this world. But for those of us who have maybe been taught that hoarding money is the path to the most lifelong security, I can say that in my experience, trading some of that money in for community and for values alignment feels way more, you know, contributes way more to my security than having that extra money would have. So that's my story about giving the gift of home equity. And now we're going to share some more ways that you all can move money towards home ownership in Black and Brown communities. The first thing we want to talk about is donating money to our partner organization, Taking Ownership. And so I want to turn it over to Randall Wyatt to maybe talk a little bit about ways we can support your organization.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. And thank you for selling me your house for a third of what you could have got for it. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I am the founder and executive director of an organization called Taking Ownership, PDX. And what we do is we raise money and we use volunteers and other resources, partnerships, you know, community, whatever we can do to provide free repairs for Black-owned homes and businesses in Portland to basically deter predatory real estate and racist real estate practices, displacement, keep the city off their back is a big thing that I like to say, because one thing, there was a report that came out recently called the Ombudsman Report that basically highlighted that the Bureau of Development Services has disproportionately been putting liens and fines on Black and Brown homes in gentrified areas because affluent white people are moving into these neighborhoods and complaining about the property maintenance of their Black and Brown neighbors. And as we all know, and as you just learned about the history of Portland, and well, that goes for the history of America, there's a wealth gap between white families and Black and Brown families due to historical economic exclusion and oppressive racist practices, and the fact that the government was handing out land and other resources to white people for hundreds of years prior to considering Black and Brown folks as the general public as well. So we do this as our equitable way. So I started it back in June of 2020. Since then, we have been able to raise close to $1 million now. We've helped over 70 Black families with many different types of repairs. We prioritize weatherization and life safety issues, and now we're getting into energy efficiency as well, trying to make sure that that they can access energy efficient resources, because that's the future for both our planet, but mostly to keep their homes healthy. We prioritize senior citizens, which is the majority of the Black homeowners that we work with, because they're the ones that were able to keep their homes through the Great Recession and other problematic banking practices. Like if you know anything about the optional arms loans and subprime loans, they were targeting these families and stripping their equity. And we prioritize single parents, low income and fixed income homeowners. How you can get involved is you can donate to the organization at takingownershippdx.org. You can set up recurring monthly donations if you like, if you'd love to continue to support us. You can become a volunteer, whether you don't have to be licensed, bonded, or really have any skills. We use volunteers mainly for basic cleanup jobs, landscaping jobs, organizing jobs. Like I said, we work with a lot of senior citizens, so they oftentimes need a lot of help with just odd jobs around their house, and so we use volunteers for that. And also, you know, if you know any organizations, companies in the home improvement realm that you think we could partner with to spread their resources and get some of these homes done. For instance, we just worked with Bird's Mouth Design. They've been donating tons of their labor to fix up homes with us. Yeah, shoot some of those resources our way. And you can do all that through the website.
Thank you, Randall.
Thank you.
And I just want to quickly mention, this is at the bottom of the slide here, that anybody who signed up via Eventbrite is going to receive an email with all these action steps. We're going to share a form for you all to complete to express interest in additional learning and action. So we're going to provide a bunch of ways for you all to stay in touch and to connect with organizations like Randall's. The link is also in the chat right now. And we're also going to send out the recording from this event. Please share it widely. We want people to hear about these action steps. We want people to hear about these amazing organizations that they can support. So the next one that we're going to talk about is there's a GoFundMe for Arietta Ward's family. And I wonder, Arietta, if you want to jump in and share a little bit about your GoFundMe campaign. And I will, in the meantime, put the link to that in the chat as well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, can you see me? Because I can't see myself.
I see you.
Yes.
Oh, well, hello. I'm Arietta Ward. Hey, everybody. And I am the daughter of local icon Janice Marie Scroggins. And she was a wonderful educator, musician, and helped a lot of people around here, you know. And, you know, but with all of that, she was also a single mother to 3 children, myself included. And being a single parent, plus being a full-time musician, and she was born in Alameda, Oklahoma. So around all that time, there was not a lot of financial literacy. And we moved into Mississippi District, and the house is still there. And when we moved there, nothing like what it does right now. You know? And there was a lot of things going on, but then we saw people coming in, and then people, our friends, moved away. We're the last ones there, you know. And we were talking about different liens and all that type of stuff. The different types of loans that she, you know, was able to get, they weren't the nicest one. Was really high interest rates and all, you know. But luckily, she was steadfast, and she wanted to make sure that she had a stable home for her children and a legacy to own a home. And that was it. And, you know, people, when things started to rise up, it was like, oh, okay, we want to buy your home. No, it's not happening. But then she unfortunately passed away in 2014. And so the house came down to us, myself, my sister, Nakasari, and my younger brother, Francis. And because of a lot of different money woes and whatnot, there were some liens that were on the house. And it's a beautiful historic home. And but in order for us to do anything with it, we need to be able to maneuver and be rid of the liens. So that is what the GoFundMe is for. And you know, she put so much into that neighborhood. She used to teach at Jeff, you know, and all the places around. She was just, the neighborhood is hers. And by helping us, you will help preserve a wonderfully beautiful icon's home, but also provide a safe, stable home for her family and descendants. My sister, with her 5 children and husband, that's where they're residing right now. And it's, you know, 30 some odd years, my younger brother was actually born in that house, you know. So it's a way to help out a wonderful legacy, you know, but also, you know, provide some things for us. We how's the best way to say it? You know, we don't have our mom, but that house is her. There was a lot of music made in that house. And there's a lot of her around, and just the trees and the bushes. It's just, that'd be something that's wonderful. usually I talk really well on stage, but when it comes to this type of stuff, it's a little bit more, a little bit more personal, and it means a lot. But I want to say thank you to you all for creating this wonderful platform and this whole presentation, because I knew a few things, but I didn't realize how wide the gap is. And so you're doing great things, and from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of my family, I want to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Arietta. Thank you for sharing your story. And thank you also for sharing your music. For those of you who noticed the music as you were signing into the Zoom today, that was Arietta's music. And like I said, the link to the GoFundMe is in the chat right now. And when we send out this follow-up email, we'll put the link in there as well. And please forward this broadly to your networks. Let's get the word out as much as possible. So I'm going to turn it over now to my co-organizer, Allison, who's going to take us through some more of these opportunities. Thank you, Arietta.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Arietta and Randall. Thank you, Annie and Sharona. And I'm going to talk a bit more about other actions that people can take. And we've tried to present a wide range of ways that people can take action, acknowledging that some of us, including those of us who are leading this training, have benefited from white wealth accumulation. And so some of the action steps we have reflect that. And then we also want action steps that kind of fit whatever everyone in this group has to offer. So 2 more ways that you can move money if you are so moved, and if that's something that you have available. And one thought that someone in our group shared is that as you file your taxes in the coming weeks, or maybe some of you have already done it, if you receive a tax refund, that can be money that you could consider redistributing if it's money that you weren't counting on, or that is, if you have more than enough, that's money that you could consider moving and redistributing in some way. So 2 other ways that you might consider moving money. The next here is Repairs Anti-Displacement Fund. So the acronym REPAIR stands for Real Estate Professionals Against Institutional Racism. And they have set up an anti-displacement fund that I believe is Portland specific. And it's an ongoing effort to help right the wrongs of our city's pattern of displacing Black homeowners. And so you can learn more about that. Oh, thank you, Amanda, in the chat. She's an organizer of Repair, that it is Portland specific. So we will share a link for that in the follow-up email. And then finally, we have the idea of supporting Neya's housing developments. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Neya Family Center serves Portland's Native community. And their housing developments are focused on providing a continuum of housing options for all members of Portland's Native community. So that is one action that you could consider that might be aligned with a sense of the land back movement, or recognizing the original stewards of this land that we are on. I invite you to start asking any questions that you have in the chat, and also feel free to add ideas in the chat of other actions that you would encourage the people who are on this call to take. Volunteering time, if that's what you have to offer. As you heard from Randall, you can volunteer with taking ownership, helping Black homeowners to stay in their homes. You could also join the advocacy efforts of Portland Neighbors Welcome, which is an advocacy group that advocates for pro-housing and pro-tenant reforms here in Portland. And if you are interested in getting involved, we have the website, and also Love, who you heard present a great history, can share more about that group. Finally, you might consider getting involved in political organizing. You heard Annie mention Resource Generation, which is a multiracial membership community of young people aged 18 to 35 with wealth and or class privilege, who are committed to the equitable distribution of wealth, land, and power. If you're interested in learning more about resource generation, they have like RG 101 type info session coming up on March 31st in the afternoon. And we'll send out info about that. And then the final political organizing opportunity that we have is to join the Portland Housing Solidarity Project, which you've now heard from the 5 co-organizers today, and it's just us. We've been meeting for about a year and working to kind of figure out what we can do in moving this kind of work forward. And if you would like to join us to help continue conversations like this one, we hope that you will let us know using the interest form that we are going to share out. So in a moment, we're going to give you a few minutes actually to fill out that form. But before we do, I wanted to again offer that if you have action items that you would encourage people on this call to consider, I hope you'll put them in the chat. I see one from Jojo. I've heard of voluntary land taxes as an idea for white settlers, paying a designated monthly amount to local indigenous tribes and organizations. That's a great idea. Thank you. So yes, keep the ideas coming and also questions coming in the chat. I think we're going to, as we prep for Q&A, but before we get to that, give you all a few minutes to complete maybe we are going to go straight into Q&A. Is that right, Sharona?
Yeah.
Okay. Then I will pass the mic to you.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and stop the recording now so that we have a safe space